December 16th, 2023. 3 o'clock local time, Red Sea. There was no room for hesitation, and the USS Carney responded instantly and with precision. Although the night seemed calm, the crew was anything but unprepared. They had already been tested by the conditions around them. But this time, the Houthis appeared to be using a completely new approach, one that until then had mostly been discussed in training rooms rather than confronted aboard an active U.S. Navy warship. Deep inside the ship in the Combat Information Center, watchstanders were focused on their screens, scanning for anything unusual. Their job was to identify and track every contact they saw, whether it was a civilian airliner, a military aircraft, or something unknown, and report its speed, heading, altitude, and likely intent. Then, in the middle of this routine work, something changed. A single radar return appeared, then several more. Almost immediately, it was clear these were not ordinary tracks. Because of the conflict in the region, many aircraft were steering clear of the area entirely, but these contacts were not following any recognized commercial air route. As the watchstanders studied the tracks, they tried to determine exactly what they were seeing. Could it be an airliner, a military aircraft, a helicopter? To find out, one of them began checking the transponder data, cycling through the various modes and codes that should have revealed at least something about the contact. Instead, what appeared on the screen was deeply unsettling. No matter how many times he refreshed the input or switched between settings, the result stayed the same. Every mode was blank, every code was blank, and the contacts were still closing in. That detail mattered. Every civilian or military aircraft carries a transponder that broadcasts on specific modes, each one providing key information. Mode 1 can indicate military identification and nationality. Mode 2 can correspond to a military aircraft's tail number. Civilian flights use modes such as Mode 3/A for flight identification, while Mode C reports altitude. The codes tied to these modes also carry meaning. For instance, if an aircraft transmits 7700 on Mode 3/A, it signals a general in-flight emergency. But here, there was nothing. No modes, no codes, just a solid radar return moving closer. The moment the watchstanders realized that none of the inbound contacts were transmitting any identifying information, the situation took on a very different meaning. Whatever was approaching was not behaving like normal air traffic, and that left very little room for doubt. Each contact was moving at roughly 100 knots, far too slow to fit the profile of a missile. It could have been a helicopter, but the crew needed confirmation. To get it, they turned to another system. Mounted along the ship's side was the SLQ-32, one of Carney's most important tools for detecting and identifying radar emissions. In many ways, it served as the ship's electronic eyes and ears. Whether the object was a ship, aircraft, missile, or helicopter, it would often be using some form of radar, and the SLQ-32 was designed to pick that up. Capable of scanning frequencies across the 2 to 18 gigahertz range at distances of more than 200 nautical miles, the SLQ-32 could electronically verify what the spy radar was detecting. It did this by comparing incoming signals to its mission library, a vast database containing the signatures of thousands of known systems. In practice, the process is straightforward. If the SPY radar detects a contact at 150 miles, that aircraft is transmitting military identification codes, and its radar signature matches a known platform, then the crew has a solid positive identification. But this situation was completely different. These contacts were not transmitting any modes or codes. They were not emitting radar. They were moving unpredictably, packed together in a large formation. Put all of that together, and the conclusion became obvious. This was a drone swarm. Once the Carney's team confirmed the ship was facing a swarm attack, the tactical action officer had to make a decision fast. There was almost no margin for delay. The drones had stayed hidden until dangerously late, partly because of their extremely small radar cross-section, around 0.01 square meters, and partly because they had been flying only about 10 feet above the water. That kept them masked until they were roughly 15 miles away. At that range, the timeline was brutal. In less than 7 minutes, the first Shahed drone could have slammed into the ship's side. Even with a warhead of only about 100 pounds, it still had enough destructive power to damage exposed radar and communications equipment mounted high on the mast. A hit there could force the ship out of the fight, and that was not an option. The danger was made even worse by the way the drones were approaching. They were not coming from just one direction. They were splitting across multiple angles, clearly meant to stretch the ship's defenses. The TAO chose to deal with the largest group first, then turned to the smaller threats. That biggest cluster, 8 drones strong, was approaching from bearing 090 relative off the starboard side. To stop it, the TAO selected the SM-2, the Standard Missile 2. This missile is one of the core weapons of naval air defense. Traveling at about Mach 3.5, it could reach the incoming Shahed 136 drones in roughly 30 seconds. On paper, firing a missile worth around $2 million at targets whose total cost might be less than a luxury SUV can sound excessive. In reality, it makes perfect sense. A tightly packed group of drones presents a combined radar signature much easier for the missile to track than a single tiny target. In effect, that group becomes much more visible, almost like a larger missile-sized object. As the SM-2 closes in during the final moments of flight, it activates its seeker for the terminal phase. Its warhead releases around 5,000 metal fragments across a wide, lethal area, large enough for one missile to tear through an entire cluster of drones in a single shot without needing an immediate follow-up. But destroying that first group was exactly the kind of response the attackers were hoping to trigger. In a swarm attack, confusion is part of the strategy. One common tactic is to send larger groups of drones that may include decoys with no real payload, that draws attention and fire toward the most obvious threat, while smaller drones approach from other directions and try to slip through unnoticed. Against a less capable Navy, that kind of tactic might have worked. But the USS Carney was not an easy target. For its crew, this was not chaos. It was a high-pressure engagement they were trained to handle, and once the largest group was gone, they shifted immediately to the next threat. Even after that first interception, 6 single drones were still inbound, approaching from both ahead of the ship and from astern. On a vessel limited to engaging in only one general direction, that kind of attack would create an impossible choice. The captain would have to decide whether to expose the bridge, risking command and control, or the stern, risking the ship's steering. Carney did not have that limitation. Thanks to the spy radar's full 360-degree coverage provided by its phased array system, the destroyer could engage a drone approaching from astern while still keeping the bow oriented toward the 5 drones coming from ahead. That flexibility came from another key weapon, the RIM-162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile. On destroyers like Carney, these missiles are packed in sets of 4 inside a single vertical launch cell, giving the ship a dense, rapid response layer of defense exactly for moments like this. Accelerating to Mach 4 almost immediately after launch, these missiles are designed for point defense, with a range of about 27 nautical miles. What makes them especially effective against fast targets at close range is a capability known as homing all the way. In practice, that means the ship can begin illuminating the incoming drones the moment the missile leaves its vertical launch cell. There is no wasted time while the missile tries to find its bearing. The second it clears the ship, it is already locked into the intercept path and driving straight toward its target. And in this case, the system performed exactly as intended. While Carney remained pointed toward the 5 drones closing in from ahead, a single missile launched from one of the aft VLS cells. The Shahed drones had no pilot on board to react or change course at the last second, so they continued along their pre-programmed waypoints without any evasive movement. Not that it would have helped much. In the final phase, the missile executed an aggressive terminal maneuver from above and removed the drone from the fight almost instantly. Even so, the danger was far from over. 5 more drones were still charging toward the ship, now only 5 miles off the bow. Fortunately, they were heading directly into the engagement zone of another weapon system. That large naval gun mounted on the forward deck is the Mark 45 5-inch gun. It can fire out to 10 miles against surface targets and reach roughly 17 kilometers in elevation. With an internal drum that holds up to 20 rounds, this long-serving weapon can still deliver serious firepower when it matters. But it was not firing the kind of round most people would expect. The 5-inch gun can use a wide range of ammunition, including inert training rounds, high-explosive point detonation rounds, illumination shells, and several other types. But against a drone swarm, none of those are the ideal choice. The challenge is simple. Against a fast, low-flying drone, the crew is not trying to score a direct metal-on-metal hit. The real goal is to get close enough for the round to do its job. That is where the ship's combat systems take over. The command and decision computers process enormous amounts of data every second. They analyze each contact's course, speed, altitude, and track history to calculate exactly how long the fuse on each round should be set before firing. The ammunition used here is known as the Mark 419 Controlled Variable Time Round, and it is built for this kind of target. Each round carries about 7 kilograms of explosive filler. It does not need a direct hit to be effective. If it passes within about 100 meters, it can still cause serious damage. Within 50 meters, it can fully neutralize the target. The key is the fuse built into the top of the round, which the gun automatically programs before the shell is loaded into the breech. That automation matters. It removes human error from the timing process and speeds everything up dramatically. No sailor has to stop, measure, recheck, and manually prepare each round with a special tool. Down in the deep magazine, the crew can keep feeding ammunition onto the hoist while the 20-round drum is continuously topped off during a sustained fight. And for a while, the system worked exactly as needed. The only complication was that the crew had not expected to rely on CVT rounds that night. As soon as General Quarters was called at the start of the engagement, the gunner's mates rushed to unload the high-explosive rounds and replace them with CVT ammunition. Once the gun was fully reloaded, the tactical action officer gave the order to open fire when the drones were only 5 miles from Kearney. Within seconds, Kearney fired 5 CVT rounds at the incoming targets. On the 5-inch gun's night vision feed, the crew could see dark bursts in the air and pieces of the drones dropping into the sea. But then another problem appeared. A sailor at a console in the CIC suddenly received an alert. The gun's fuse setter had failed. In a way, it was not entirely surprising. That function was rarely used, and after only a few shots, it stopped working. Without the ability to program the fuses correctly, the CVT rounds were no longer effective. That left the crew with one final layer of defense. Just behind the 5-inch mount sits a system that almost looks like a weaponized R2D2. It is called the Close-In Weapon System, or CIWS. Destroyers configured like Kearney normally carry one forward and one aft. In this fight, the forward CIWS was about to deal with the last 2 drones. There were only seconds left before impact, but for CIWS, that was still enough time. Unlike many of the ship's other combat systems, CIWS operates largely as a self-contained unit. It has its own tracking radar, which means it does not rely directly on a SPY radar for every engagement. In a sense, it works like a much smaller version of SPY, though over a far shorter distance. It can track multiple targets at once, with a detection range of around 10 miles and an engagement range of roughly 3 miles. When it fires, it does so through a 6-barreled 20mm Gatling gun. The rate of fire is astonishing, about 4,500 rounds per minute. At that pace, the system can burn through its entire magazine in under 20 seconds. In reality, it usually does not need nearly that much. A 1-second burst can send dozens of rounds downrange, more than enough to tear apart a small incoming target. And the most remarkable part is that it can do all of this without waiting for a sailor to press the trigger. Despite what many people think, CIWS can operate in several different modes. In a situation like this, with threats approaching from multiple directions and almost no time left, the tactical action officer almost certainly ordered it into anti-air warfare auto mode, or AAW auto. In that setting, the system acts on its own. If its radar identifies something moving fast enough and closing on the ship, it engages immediately. By taking human reaction time out of the equation, CIWS can respond the instant a target enters its envelope. In a fight measured in seconds, that speed matters. As the final 2 drones came within 2 miles of the ship, the CIWS opened fire with its unmistakable burst. Maybe it does not have the same reputation as some aircraft guns people love to talk about, but it remains an incredibly effective system, and within moments, those last drones were reduced to debris. With the immediate danger over, the crew did not relax. They kept scanning every sensor for signs of another wave. SPY radar continued searching for possible missile threats, while the crew used the SLQ-32 to look for the distinctive signal of a missile seeker. Drone strikes are often paired with missile launches or the other way around, specifically to overload and confuse the target. But Kearney's crew was not an ordinary crew. They were already experienced, already tested, and already proven under pressure. And the Houthis would learn that again and again during the deployment, as the ship went on to face roughly 51 engagements throughout 2023 and 2024. That is all for now.